The Montana sun hung low over the Blackwood Ranch, casting long shadows across the weathered porch where Sarah stood clutching her stomach, her face pale as fresh snow. It had been 3 weeks since she'd arrived as a mail-order bride to Thomas Blackwood, a man of few words but deep integrity, and in those weeks she'd tried desperately to hide the pain that had been growing inside her. Thomas noticed everything, though. The way she winced when she thought he wasn't looking, how she'd stopped eating more than a few bites at meals, the shadows deepening under her eyes day by day. He'd given her space, respecting the boundaries of their arrangement, but watching her suffer in silence was tearing him apart, in ways he hadn't expected when he'd placed that advertisement in the Boston paper months ago. That evening, as Thomas returned from mending fences in the north pasture, he found Sarah sitting on the porch steps, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked up at him with such vulnerability that his heart clenched. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I need to tell you something. I've been aching down there in my stomach. It's been getting worse, and I'm frightened." The confession cost her everything, her pride, her carefully maintained composure, the walls she'd built to protect herself in this strange new life. She'd left Boston to escape poverty and a future in the factories, answering his advertisement with hope and desperation in equal measure. Now she feared he'd send her back, that she'd be too much trouble, too broken for the simple life he'd promised in his letters. Thomas knelt before her without hesitation, his calloused hands gentle as he took hers. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. When she admitted it had been weeks, even before she'd made the journey west, his jaw tightened. He'd grown up in these mountains, the nearest doctor a day's ride away in Copper Creek, and he'd seen what happened when people waited too long to seek help. His own mother had died from appendicitis when he was 12 because his father had been too proud to admit something was wrong until it was too late. He wouldn't make that mistake. "We're going to Doc Harrison tomorrow at first light," he said firmly, then softened his tone when he saw fear flash in her eyes. "Sarah, you're my wife now, in name if not yet in heart. That means your well-being matters to me more than the cattle, more than this ranch, more than my own stubborn pride." That night, Thomas prepared the wagon with blankets and supplies for the long journey. Sarah watched from the window, surprised by the efficiency of his movements and the determination in his stance. She'd expected a lonely cowboy when she'd agreed to this arrangement, perhaps someone rough around the edges who needed a cook and housekeeper more than a companion. Instead, she'd found a man who read books by lamplight, who spoke kindly to his horses, who had welcomed her without demands or expectations. Now, seeing him prepare to drop everything for her sake, something shifted in her chest. She'd protected her heart carefully since arriving, afraid to hope for more than survival. But watching him work through the darkness, she felt that protection beginning to crack. Thomas came inside to find her trying to pack a bag with trembling hands. He covered her hands with his own, stilling them. "Rest," he commanded gently. "I'll take care of everything." He guided her to the bed they'd never shared. He'd been sleeping in the barn loft since her arrival, giving her privacy and time to adjust. Now he sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. When I sent for a bride, I wasn't just looking for someone to cook meals and mend shirts. I was looking for a partner, someone to build a life with. These past weeks, watching you tend the garden, hearing you sing while you work, seeing how gentle you are with the animals, you've brought light to this place that's been dark too long." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Whatever's wrong, we'll face it together." That's what the vows meant. Even if we spoke them to a tired preacher in a dusty town hall. Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks again. But these were different from the ones born of pain and fear. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you'd think I'd deceived you, that I'd come here damaged and useless." Thomas shook his head, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "The only thing that would disappoint me is if you'd kept suffering, alone when I could help. Tomorrow we ride to Copper Creek and Doc Harrison will figure out what's wrong. But tonight you need to rest and you need to know you're not alone anymore. Not in this, not in anything." He stood to leave, to return to his makeshift quarters in the barn. But Sarah's voice stopped him. "Thomas, could you stay? Just sit in the chair there? I don't want to be alone. Tonight." He pulled the old rocking chair close to the bed without a word, settling in for the long night ahead, keeping watch over the woman, who'd become far more important to him than he'd ever anticipated. It felt strange at first being fed like a child, but there was something deeply comforting about Thomas's gentle persistence. The broth was delicious, warming her from the inside, and after a few spoonfuls, Sarah found herself opening her mouth readily for the next bite. Thomas watched her carefully, noting the slight color returning to her cheeks, the way her shoulders relaxed as the warmth and nourishment began to work their magic. When I was back in Boston, Sarah said quietly between spoonfuls, there were days when I'd have only a piece of stale bread and some weak tea. I worked in a textile factory, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The pay was barely enough for rent in a boarding house where 6 of us shared one room. Food was always the first thing I'd sacrifice to make sure I had a roof over my head. Her voice was matter of fact, but Thomas could hear the pain underneath. The other girls and I would pool our resources sometimes, buy a loaf of bread or some cheese to share, but there were weeks when even that wasn't possible. Thomas continued feeding her, his jaw tight with anger at a world that would treat people so callously. How long, he asked. How long were you living like that? Sarah met his eyes. 3 years. My parents died of typhoid when I was 17. They'd been factory workers too, and there was no money left after the funeral expenses. I had no other family, no skills except what I could learn in the factory. I thought about trying to find work as a domestic servant, but those positions were scarce and usually went to girls with references. I was alone and desperate, and the factory was hiring. She paused while Thomas offered her another spoonful of broth. The work was brutal. The machinery was dangerous. I saw girls lose fingers. One girl got her hair caught in a loom and was nearly scalped before they could stop the machine. The air was full of cotton dust that made everyone cough. The foreman, he was cruel. If you didn't meet your quota, he'd dock your pay or worse. Sarah's hands trembled slightly at the memory. Some of the girls accepted his special attention in exchange for better positions or slightly higher pay. I refused, which meant I was always assigned the worst jobs, always the first to have my pay docked for the slightest mistake. Thomas set down the bowl, his hands clenching into fists. Did he ever? He couldn't finish the question, but Sarah understood. He tried once, she said softly. Cornered me in the storeroom after my shift. But one of the other girls had warned me about his habits, so I'd started carrying a hat pin with me everywhere. I stabbed him in the hand when he grabbed me, then ran. He never bothered me again, but he made my life even harder after that. I think he was trying to force me to quit, but I had nowhere else to go. That's when you saw my advertisement, Thomas said, understanding dawning. Sarah nodded. A girl in the boarding house showed it to me. She'd been reading a newspaper someone had left behind, looking at all the advertisements for mail-order brides. She was too afraid to answer any of them, but she thought I might be brave enough or desperate enough. Your advertisement was different from the others. You didn't ask for a beauty or specify an age range. You just said you were looking for an honest woman willing to work hard and build a life together. You mentioned the ranch, the mountains, the clean air. It sounded like paradise compared to the factory. Thomas picked up the rice pudding, offering her a spoonful. She accepted it, savoring the creamy sweetness. I spent my last few dollars on paper and postage to write to you, she continued. I told myself that even if you rejected me, at least I'd tried for something better. When your letter came back saying you'd send money for the train ticket, I cried. I couldn't believe someone would take a chance on me like that. I gave notice at the factory that same day. The foreman looked pleased to be rid of me. I used the 2 weeks before I left to eat as much as I could, trying to build up my strength for the journey, but it wasn't enough. I was already so run down. And then you arrived here and didn't say anything, Thomas said, continuing to feed her the pudding. You worked in the garden, tended the chickens, tried to cook and clean despite being in pain and barely able to function. Sarah, why didn't you tell me? Did you think I'd send you back? Sarah looked down at her hands. I thought if you knew how damaged I was, how weak and useless, you'd regret sending for me. I thought if I could just push through, prove that I could be the wife you needed, then maybe I'd earn the right to stay. I was so afraid of being sent back to Boston, back to the factory or worse. This place, this life with you, even feeling sick and scared. It was still so much better than what I'd left behind. Thomas set aside the half-eaten pudding and took both her hands in his. Sarah, look at me. When she raised her eyes to his, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not pity, but respect, admiration, and something deeper that she was afraid to name. You've already earned the right to stay 100 times over, not by working yourself to exhaustion or hiding your pain, but just by being who you are. A woman brave enough to cross a continent alone, strong enough to survive 3 years of hell, and still have hope for something better, honest enough to tell me your story even though you're afraid of how I'll